For years, Jon Jones occupied a position in the UFC that very few fighters have ever experienced. Whenever his name entered a conversation, entire divisions seemed willing to pause, opponents adjusted their careers around his decisions, and the promotion itself often appeared prepared to wait as long as necessary to make things work. Whether fans loved him or hated him, there was always a feeling that Jon Jones operated by a different set of rules, which is why the situation unfolding right now feels so unusual, because for the first time in a very long time, Jones appears to want something from the UFC, and the UFC simply isn't interested in giving it to him. At first glance, the story seems simple. The UFC is planning what could become the biggest event in company history with the proposed White House card. Jon Jones wants to be part of it, and Dana White has repeatedly shut down the possibility. But the deeper you look, the more it starts to feel like this isn't really a story about the White House card at all. Instead, it feels like the final chapter of a much bigger power struggle that has been building behind the scenes for over a year, one that began during the Tom Aspinall saga and may have permanently changed the UFC's relationship with its biggest star. To understand why Dana White appears so determined to keep Jones away from the event, you have to go back to the heavyweight title situation that dominated the sport for months, because as Tom Aspinall continued winning and establishing himself as the clear future of the division, fans became increasingly frustrated by the fact that the biggest fight in heavyweight MMA still wasn't happening. Everywhere you looked, the same questions kept appearing. When would Jones fight Aspinall? Was the UFC delaying the fight? Was Jones avoiding the matchup? Was Dana White losing control of the situation? As the pressure continued building, Dana repeatedly assured fans that the fight would happen, and despite all the criticism surrounding the situation, there was still a widespread belief that the UFC would eventually deliver the matchup everybody wanted to see. In fact, as time went on, it seemed like the company was finally approaching the finish line. The confidence coming from UFC leadership appeared stronger. Reports continued surfacing about progress behind the scenes, and for the first time, there was a genuine sense that the heavyweight division was finally about to move forward. Then, just as the sport appeared ready for the biggest heavyweight fight in years, Jon Jones stunned the MMA world by announcing his retirement.
Heavyweight division, take the title away from him.
Jon Jones called us last night and retired. Jon Jones is officially retired. Tom Aspinall is the heavyweight champion of the UFC.
The fact that the illustrious career of Jon Jones, the supposed greatest of all time, ends at a post-fight press conference in Baku, Azerbaijan, is a joke. Is an absolute joke. I'm sorry, but this is an absolute joke. Tom Aspinall is going to Las Vegas. At the very least, present him the title. At the very least, do something to make it up for this guy who has been sitting there watching his career just waste away for the past 7 months. Oh, by the way, his last fight was almost a year ago, 11 months. Do something. This is the way it happens. This is the way it happens. Something that could have happened at the post-fight press conference in New York. Jon Jones never wanted to take this fight.
Bringing the entire storyline to an abrupt end and leaving fans wondering how a situation that had consumed the sport for so long could suddenly disappear overnight. The reaction was immediate, but what made it even more fascinating was how quickly the conversation changed. At first, many fans accepted Jones's decision and viewed it as a legendary fighter walking away on his own terms after building one of the greatest careers the sport has ever seen. Others were far more skeptical, believing the timing raised questions that still hadn't been answered. But regardless of which side people supported, the heavyweight division finally began moving forward. Tom Aspinall was no longer forced to wait. The UFC started focusing on a future without Jon Jones, and for a brief moment, it genuinely felt like the story was over. Then something happened that changed everything. Almost as soon as discussions surrounding a potential UFC White House card began generating headlines, Jon Jones suddenly appeared interested in fighting again. Interviews started appearing, conversations about future opponents began resurfacing, and before long it became obvious that Jones wanted to be part of the event. From his perspective, it made perfect sense. This wasn't just another pay-per-view or another title fight. This was potentially the biggest event in UFC history, the kind of spectacle capable of attracting worldwide attention and placing everyone involved at the center of one of the most historic moments the sport has ever seen. For a fighter whose entire career has been built around legacy, greatness, and proving himself on the grandest stages imaginable, the opportunity must have been impossible to ignore. The problem, however, was that while Jones appeared eager to re-enter the conversation, Dana White seemed to be looking at the situation through a completely different lens, and the more he spoke about Jones, the clearer it became that this wasn't really about rankings, championships, opponents, or even fighting anymore. It was about trust. Because from the UFC's perspective, this wasn't simply another business decision. The company had already spent months building around Jones. The heavyweight division had already been placed on hold while everyone waited for answers. Public promises had already been made, expectations had already been created, and just as the UFC appeared ready to finally move forward, Jones walked away from the entire situation. Whether fans believe that criticism is fair or not doesn't really matter, because what matters is how Dana White appears to view it. And judging by his comments, many fans believe the UFC no longer sees Jones as a reliable centerpiece for an event of this magnitude. That's what makes the White House card situation so interesting, because as Jones continued publicly campaigning for a place on the event, many people began assuming there had to be discussions taking place behind closed doors. Rumors started spreading throughout the MMA media, fans debated potential opponents, and before long, a narrative developed suggesting that Jones might actually be working his way back into the UFC's
You're retired,
plans.
but now it seems like you're getting back into it.
Yes,
Can you
ma'am.
just explain it, break it down for us a little bit?
I was retired. I felt like I was at a place where I've done it all in the MMA space, and felt like there wasn't too many more challenges for me, and I just wanted to do something more than championships and money. And Donald Trump mentioned that he wanted to have a fight at the White House Garden, and that just seems like such a huge opportunity. Just to be able to entertain the country and the world at this level at the White House, it just means the world to me. So I'm back.
Yet just as that momentum started building, Dana White completely shut the conversation down, publicly insisting that Jones was never involved in discussions for the card at all, and dismissing the speculation in a way that immediately reignited controversy throughout the MMA community. And that's where this story stops being about a fight and starts becoming a story about power. Because for most of his career, Jon Jones held leverage that almost no fighter in UFC history could match. His accomplishments made him valuable, his star power made him difficult to ignore, and his dominance inside the octagon made him nearly impossible to replace. Whenever Jones wanted something, there was usually a feeling that the UFC would eventually find a way to make it happen, which is exactly why this situation feels so different from anything we've seen before. For the first time in years, Jon Jones appears to be the one chasing the opportunity rather than controlling it, and that shift may explain why the relationship between Jones and the UFC suddenly feels so strained. If Jones had fought Aspinall, this situation probably never happens. If Jones had remained active, this situation probably never happens. If he hadn't retired just as the UFC appeared ready to move forward, Dana White might be having a completely different conversation today. Instead, the company adapted, new plans were created, Tom Aspinall became the new face of the heavyweight division, and the UFC slowly stopped building its future around Jon Jones. By the time Jones decided he wanted back in, he may have discovered that something had fundamentally changed behind the scenes. Control. For years, Jones held it. For years, the UFC waited for it. For years, entire divisions revolved around it. But once the company moved on and started creating a future without him, that leverage began disappearing, and now many fans believe the real reason Jon Jones won't be fighting on the White House card has nothing to do with his age, his ability, or even finding the right opponent. The real issue appears to be trust, because the UFC no longer seems willing to place one of the most important events in company history in the hands of a fighter who already walked away from its biggest heavyweight storyline once before. Whether that's fair or unfair will be debated by fans for years, but one thing is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. For most of his career, Jon Jones was the fighter nobody could afford to say no to. Now, as the UFC prepares for what could become the biggest event it has ever promoted, Dana White appears perfectly comfortable doing exactly that. And if that doesn't show how dramatically the balance of power has shifted behind the scenes, nothing will.